Hello and welcome to Hot Topic. I'm Hugh Riches. In this first programme of Hot Topic's European election coverage, I'm talking to Vicky Dunn, the number 3 candidate for the Green Party for the European parliamentary elections. Vicky, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
May I start with a characteristic and definitive green policy, which is energy policy. Your literature suggests that with Europe-wide wind farms and connectors, that they could supply up to 40% of our electricity in a trouble-free way by 2030. Only 40%. Where's the other 60% to come from?
I think the key is in the trouble-free way that grid integration can be done at about 40%. The rest of it will come from burning the remaining gas, coal and the decline in nuclear. I think there's a misconception that Greens want to turn everything renewable overnight. What it's also important to look at is the total amount that we use, and we're talking about a 40% of a much less total use because we can make improvements in efficiency and in insulation and reduce the amount that we use.
When you mention nuclear there, continuing to use nuclear, that's part of Green Party policy. There's been nuclear power for about half a century or so, and every 10 years or so there's a 3 Mile Island or a Chernobyl or a Japanese tsunami breach of reactors. Are you happy about continuing to use nuclear?
Not at all, but you can't close the existing generation overnight. You'll cause chaos for the economy, you'll put the lights out, which is what Greens are sometimes accused of wanting to do. We certainly don't want to do that, but you need to wind things down. Not build any more, certainly, but wind down what we've got in a controlled way. It should also be remembered we shouldn't build more because we've no idea what it's going to cost the taxpayer to decommission existing nuclear power stations, other than the bill will be awfully large.
Occasionally the Green Party is accused of being a one-issue party. This energy security is a point where you have to address all sorts of other issues far more globally. That 40% supply by clean, trouble-free methods, is that still going to apply if Russia decides to turn off the taps with the gas and the oil?
It doubly applies to the more we insulate our homes, the less we depend on unstable parts of the world for gas, and the less we have to go to increasingly desperate methods like fracking, like extracting ever smaller, ever more difficult pots of oil to get, of gas to get, which might be, say, under the retreating ice sheets. Efficiency removes us from the need to do those things so much.
But that dependence on Russian or Middle Eastern energy that Europe has, and this is a European parliamentary question, that independence from that might lie in fracking. Fracking is a new technology that might supply another half century or more of cheap energy.
It could do, although it's yet unproven. But I think with fracking, you've got the two main arguments about fracking. The one is the local impact. What will it do to the water? What will it do to the house prices? What will it do to the air quality locally? And to some extent, the fracking companies have got answers to those issues. If you look through Cordrilla's website, they'll explain how they can be clean, they can be regulated, that the Environment Agency, or what's left of it, will be able to look after things in a controlled way. What they've got no answers for is what the International Panel on Climate Change is telling us, what nearly all of the scientists are telling us, and what nearly all of the peer-reviewed science is telling us, that we need to leave it in the ground. And to take this country off on a renewed dependence on gas at this time would just be completely the wrong direction to go.
So if only 40% can be clean, then you reckon you save the rest by house efficiency, industrial efficiency, that you don't need that much more energy, that you need to have the further technologies, the further resources being used to burn.
The total amount that we'll be using will be less.
And how, in order to make those industries more efficient, to insulate houses, to create that heat-saving, energy-saving environment, that itself will have a cost, won't it?
It will, but it's also a very jobs-rich industry, which is where we start to see double benefits for the UK. And there's even a triple benefit that if you insulate somebody's house, their bills come down. They've got more income to spend on what they want to spend it on, or they're not going to be costing the NHS because they're cold and suffering health problems.
So you tax the companies that create energy efficiency in order to pay for the energy efficiency, in order to pay the companies to create the energy efficiency.
We could even move further upstream than that and stop giving out massive subsidies to the large fossil fuel companies, which is the case at the moment.
Moving on to just another very connected issue, climate change. You would wish to have carbon emissions reduced massively. Again, this is all these environmental policies are decades long term, looking forward. But you'd wish to reduce carbon by down to 10% of 1990 levels by the year 2030. Again, will there be any industry if nobody's allowed to burn anything?
I think industry will be different. I think that's what we're starting to see on the Humber, that we're putting a lot of offshore wind in, that there is biomass used to burn for generation, although there are sustainability issues associated with where the biomass comes from. In principle, burning some biomass for electricity or putting it through anaerobic digesters to make gas, in principle, some of that is good technology and technology we should be using. The targets don't sound that extreme. You'd expect green targets to be in front of the nationally agreed target.
Well, 90% cut by 2030 sounds quite extreme.
The national target is 80% by 2050, so we're not calling for so far in front of that. I think an important differentiation with what Greens are calling for as well is the amount of community-owned energy and the amount of microgeneration with public buildings, schools and people's own homes generating a lot of their own power through solar panels, through their heating systems, whether they've got heat pumps or biomass fuel. A lot more of that. That's why wind energy has got so much more community acceptance in Denmark and Germany, because so much of it is community owned. People that hear the turbine creak and think, oh, that's a dreadful noise, they hear it go around and think, ka-ching.
So if you own your own turbine, you really don't mind having
Or if
energy.
you've got shares in the community one, which is...
Or if it's directly cutting your bills.
Yes.
Just one more thing on the carbon emissions thing, that it will cost a lot of money to put filters in chimneys or take up whatever the technology is to reduce the carbon that's emitted by industries that are making things that we all want and employing us. That cost is going to be pushed down to the customer, isn't it? We're going to have to pay more for the things we want because they're going to become more expensive to manufacture, because they're going to have to be manufactured more cleanly.
That is true. I'm going to, as green policies usually do, take the argument upstream here. Do we need to have so many material things to be happy in our lives? Is it true that we need this vast mountain of stuff that is mined, that is processed, that is enjoyed for 6 months or a year and is then dropped in the bin? Is that necessary for human happiness? And if a lot of the economy and a lot of the jobs is based on people repairing things, on people reusing things, on people amusing themselves and enjoying themselves without a vast need for material things, then I don't think quality of life will be any worse, and I think people will have gainful and useful employment. The economy can be different.
I think that's, we should all, a less materialistic life might be a very attractive idea, but that's possible for many, but a lot of people just won't choose that. You'd rather be imposing that choice on them.
It's very difficult to impose things. If you can show that there's a better thing over there, then some people will move towards it. But prices are going to rise because resources are getting short and it's simple supply and demand. And I often think of the example, you don't need there to be no bread in Tesco for there to be an argument and a fight. You just need there to be 20 people and only 19 loaves of bread. So for social stability, we need to start moving more towards using less.
We'll have to stop there for a break, Vicky, forgive me, but on that point, we'll go to a break. Welcome back to Hot Topic. I'm talking to Vicky Dunn, who is the candidate for the European Parliament for Humber and York for the Green Party. Vicky, we were just talking about some of your policies. If I can turn to agriculture, the Green Party is against genetic modification. Some would say this is the solution to starvation for millions across the world.
They would say that, wouldn't they? To gain public acceptance for their products.
But is it true?
I don't think so. I think starvation's often a matter of money and of imbalances in international trade. I think some of the problems of starvation we're starting to see now are due to droughts, which we will see a lot more of as climate change advances. I think we should also remember that privatisation, that genetic modification is about the privatisation of a seed. And we saw with Monsanto's Terminator gene, they were selling seed to farmers in India, which would be sterile. So they could no longer...
They called it the Terminator gene.
The Terminator gene.
That's what its own manufacturers call it.
Yes. Because
that's very poor PR, isn't it?
The purpose, I suppose it is good PR if you want to sell the gene amongst the international biotech companies who would pay a lot for this patent. The seed was sterile, which meant that year after year after year you have to go back to Monsanto and buy some more seed, which was putting farmers into starvation.
But even if that's the case and you have to re-buy your seed stock every year, which seems a very inefficient way and un-agricultural way of growing crops, if by some economic and agricultural mechanism that creates more food than the non-modified way of growing crops, isn't that a net good?
In principle, being able to grow more food crops is a net good, although we had the example of the vitamin A rice, which was really good for preventing blindness in children if they managed to eat 7 kilograms of it a day. But in principle, it was good.
Well,
the other thing we should look at is that 50% of Europe's grain is fed to animals. Do we seriously need such a massive inefficiency in the system? Do we seriously need to eat meat every day? These are some of the questions. We're told we need this potentially dangerous technology which consolidates the grip of the biotech companies on the international food system, and we need this to prevent starvation because us and the biotech companies are so kind, but we don't look at other parts of the system.
You make points that have no doubt a scientific and environmental rationality here, but the idea that we need fewer things made for us and should buy fewer things because of the carbon emissions, that we might find ourselves having to eat less meat or no meat, it might give a tone that the Green Party has a slightly puritanical streak through it.
No.
Is that the case?
No, that's not the experience I've had of Green Party people at all. We've been a fairly happy, free-spirited, enjoyable bunch.
But there's an unfair, no doubt, clearly unfair image of sandals and hairy jumpers and things like that. And nothing wrong with sandals or hairy jumpers. But no, quite exactly.
Check my jumper.
What can I say? But there does seem to be, the Green Party does seem to have sort of the inheritance of the Puritans in some ways. That's an unfair image or an out-of-date image?
I think it's an out-of-date image, and I think in our attitudes to minorities and in our attitudes to how we would like women, people from ethnic minorities, people who are gay treated, I think the Green Party was far and away at the beginning, wishing to treat everybody in a better and a more equal and fair way.
Well, that's quite right too, but in terms of treating minorities, in terms of gender equality and sexuality equality and all these things, that's not controversial anymore. All the other parties would say the same thing. Nobody's going to stand up and say, I want to discriminate against women.
Well, you might be able to get some of the other parties in to do that if you're lucky.
I don't think they get many votes, or they'd lose more than they'd win. But anyway, the point is, is that doesn't distinguish you or differentiate you necessarily from other parties. And I will talk about some of your other policies here as well, because I think they do distinguish you without necessarily being environmental policies. But quite a lot of, for instance, your policy papers, your election leaflets talk about having smaller class sizes in schools, harmonious communities. Nobody's going to object to smaller class sizes or harmonious communities. Every party is saying that. That's not something that's a reason to vote Green.
I think the real reason to vote Green is the other parties have lost sight of what's the common good. Most of them are captured by the interests of large corporations, like the example you gave. Let's have genetically modified seeds because it's good for the world. It's like, no, it's because it's privatising resources for the large corporations. And I think the Green Party really is out there in the sort of middle ground of the left now on its own. The Labour Party's moved so far to the right and the others are to the right of that, looking at what is the common person's interest.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to come on to. Privatisation is the word, or re-public ownership. Your policies for the state to take back over all the utilities, energy, water, the post office and the railways. And to renationalise these things as like a sort of a new Clement Attlee. That really is quite a long way to the left of any of the other parties. Some would say that makes the Green Party the only socialist party, now that the Labour Party seems to be a sort of a central
I wouldn't
left party.
disagree with that. I am a socialist. I would not disagree. I think also the public doesn't disagree. Recent polling said that 69% would like to see the railways back in public hands and, you know, run decently with profits reinvested rather than siphoned out for the benefits of their shareholders.
But we'll take the railways as an example. Quite apart from the fact that they're a more environmentally friendly way to travel than a private car, which is the most sort of disastrous environmental invention, the internal combustion engine, the railways are not that much more expensive and more efficient now under private hands than they were when they were owned by the state.
I don't think that's been people's experience. I think fares have risen year on year. Services have not dramatically improved and the state still puts in quite a lot of money, comparable sums to what it put in before. And we get fiascos like the West Coast Main Line. What was going on there? How much did they spend letting the contract and taking it back and faffing around? I think it's a national asset and a strategic asset and it ought to be in public hands.
Just going on to the idea of small parties standing in the European election, taking part in the democracy, for which as always thanks, but there's a possibility now that the 2 or 3 main parties have become so unpopular, the coalition is unattractive in some ways, or at least it's put people off. The Labour Party doesn't seem to be very charismatic. The smaller parties are UKIP and a BNP. Not that you have anything in common, any of the 3 of you, but does that success of small parties, anti-politics politics, does your success risk also increasing the success of other small parties of whom you might not be so fond?
I would always say to that the only wasted vote is one that you don't believe in. And the Green Party's policies are ones which people can believe in. You know, we're not captured by private interests. We're trying to represent the ordinary people and we're trying to represent what scientists are telling us are the natural constraints of the world that we live in. Like it or not, you know, you don't want to tell somebody to change their lifestyle for no good reason, but if we can put... Who bothered to recycle before those handy plastic boxes were put there? Only the committed. Once the handy plastic boxes were put there, it became normal. So I think a vote for the Green Party, we really can represent something much bigger.
Why the European Parliament? What can you do at that level in the European Parliament? You have 7% of the present European Parliament that's going out in the next couple of weeks, 48 MEPs. What can Europe do?
Europe's important. You've got 2 poles of opinion on Europe. You've got the Europe's great and it'll solve all our economic woes, or Europe's dreadful and caused all our economic woes. Well, I think the Greens are in the middle saying we need to turn up in Europe, take part and get some sense out of it. Can
I think, final question. You've said that it's an environmental party, the Green Party, and a socialist party. How does a non-socialist, sort of old-fashioned, small L, liberal, capitalist, conservative, whatever, who cares about the environment, how do they vote?
I think they should look at our policies. I don't think there's anything that I've said tonight that sounds extreme, unreasonable, or not based in science or common sense. I think they should look at it, and they should look at the alternative. And they certainly shouldn't not vote. I'll have to stop you there, Vicky. Thank you very much. That's it for this one. Join me in the next Hot Topic. Thank you very much. Goodbye.